What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Wasteland 2, specifically the director's cut. And while I very much so loved Wasteland 3 and covered it a great deal, I can honestly say that I had never played Wasteland 2, which is a little bit embarrassing, so we have to fix that obviously, which is what we're doing here. But before we jump into that, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on YouTube, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. If you're curious about everything that entails and you go to my channel and you aren't subscribed, first video you'll see is a video explaining everything, and my Steam profile is public and linked in the description below. Feel free to check it out. So from here, let's dive in. Though the first thing I want to talk about is the story of how Wasteland 2 came to be a little bit, because it is relatively interesting. As I'm sure at least a few people watching this are aware, Wasteland actually predated Fallout by about 10 years. However, unlike Fallout, we didn't get a sequel for about 26 years, which is of course Wasteland 2. Wasteland 2 was one of several games that sort of saw a revival of the genre in the early 2010s, which was in large part driven by Kickstarter campaigns. And while in that scenario it might be very tempting, if you will, to just completely reboot the series, what is especially interesting to me about that whole situation is that Wasteland 2 is a true successor to the original Wasteland. Many of the characters are recurring, much of the story follows the original game, along with a myriad of other tiny details that just straight up carry forth everything that the original Wasteland was. So before we even dive into the particulars of Wasteland 2, I've got to say I really admire that level of dedication to a franchise and respecting it, because I don't think anyone would have blamed them if they just rebooted the franchise more or less. And having already played Wasteland 3, I've got to tell you what was most remarkable about this experience for me was seeing all of the characters that have carried forth across all of these games. But from there, let's talk a little bit about the story setup for Wasteland 2. We are fresh rangers. We have just joined up with the desert rangers. We can either choose to make a custom party or take a set of default rangers, and we'll talk about character creation here in a minute. However, the game opens with a burial. A desert ranger has recently been killed, and you are sent to investigate this person's death, as they were attempting to set up radio repeaters, allowing the desert rangers to strengthen their radio signal so they can decode some very cryptically weird messages that they've been receiving via the radio. As this is a post-apocalypse, radio technology has become incredibly important. And while I certainly do have more to say about the story, interestingly enough, the main story is pretty much that. Which is surprising, because for a game that actually does handle choice and consequence really well, the main story is probably one of the blandest parts of the game, because its presence is kind of negligible. The main objective never really felt like something that was pressing and immediate. There wasn't a lot of push to get it done. Most of the areas you go to have a bunch of secondary objectives that you complete, and then at the end of them you might eventually get to, oh yeah, this main story thing that was going on. Which is kind of curious, because as I said, the rest of the game does handle choice and consequence really well. In fact, right out of the gate, the game pretty much throws one of the most substantial choices you're going to make in your playthrough, which is to save either High Pool or the Ag Center. Whichever one you choose to save, of course, gets saved, and the other gets destroyed. It's also possible for both of them to get destroyed if you drag your feet for too long. And this is interesting for a number of reasons. Obviously, because we see unique content depending on which one we go to, but also because it affects the main story. If both of them get destroyed, you have to fall back on main story plan B, which involves going to a few different locations as well. But both High Pool and the Ag Center are very important. High Pool is the most reliable source of water in the Arizona desert, and the Ag Center is what grows most of the food in the area. So the loss of either of them would be a huge blow to the resources of everyone that lives in this post-apocalyptic desert. Though, while I think this is a great example of Wasteland 2 handling choice and consequence, I also think it's very representative of how clumsily some of it is handled in a few cases, because you don't get to go to High Pool or Ag Center first and then you get to make this choice. You get thrown into this decision before you even really know anything about these places. You likely haven't even visited them yet, which means the choice that gets made here is largely just random. It's just whichever one you decided to go to first, having no real idea about what's there, etc. And most of the story, as well as the locations and areas you're going to, play out in much the same way, albeit slightly less dramatically. This is really the only timed thing in the game, and beyond this, you're free to go where you please for the most part, take as long as you want, that kind of thing. But most areas you go to have some sort of conflict that needs resolving, and there's multiple options to work your way through it, which is going to lead to a variety of outcomes which will then affect certain areas. But your main goal is to get to radio towers to set up repeaters to decode this radio signal. And that's most of the game, really, which leads you to this interesting situation where the main plot is almost the least interesting thing that there is to do. Though, while we do spend most of the game in the desert, I would say, the last half of it roughly actually takes place in California. And to their credit, they didn't just slightly redo some things and say you're in California. That second half of the game genuinely feels like a new area. As you're traveling the desert in the main part of the game, you have to do things like collect water, which isn't difficult, but it really drives home that resources are scarce. And then you get to California, which has plenty of water and vegetation, and this becomes less of an issue. So even in small, subtle ways that aren't a huge deal by any means, they managed to separate these two areas. I would say California is a little bit shorter than Arizona's area, probably about a 60-40 split. I do think that switch was a bold move that largely works out. So overall, I'd say the story is relatively cool. I really enjoyed their emphasis on choice and consequence, but you can tell it's one of those early revival CRPGs that handles it in some slightly clunky ways that later games kind of worked out. Now, from here, let's actually talk about difficulty a little bit. We have Rookie through Supreme Jerk, which is basically easy through very difficult, and you tend to hear that this particular game is much harder than Wasteland 3, and while I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, it's mostly down to the system at play and knowledge, because you can very much so create a team in Wasteland 2 here that covers basically all of your bases, but you definitely need to know what you're doing beforehand. And like a lot of CRPGs, when you play through it the first time and you don't have that knowledge, you're probably going to run into a few pain points. Probably none more so than the back half of the game in California, because whereas Arizona is a relatively easy stretch, California has enemies that are very high health, high damage, and almost entirely robots. Robots take reduced physical damage from quite a few weapons via their armor rating, and that can make them a pain unless you're specifically built to deal with them. They take insane damage from energy weapons and explosives. And there's little things like that throughout the game that once you learn them, very easy to work around, but not knowing them and then hitting them without having the options or choices having been made up to that point to get you through it can lead to a feeling of the game being pretty rough, especially in the early game, because even with a min-max character, your hit chance at the beginning of the game is gonna suck. It's gonna be like 60-ish% probably, and that's probably one of the most important things to overcome early in the game is pump up your weapon skills to get a better chance to hit to deal with combat encounters, and then by the time you leave the first area or the first big area, which is probably going to be High Pool or the Ag Center, you'll likely be leveled up and in a good enough place to be pretty set actually. Got a good hit chance, more equipment, ammo, because all that stuff is really hard to come by in the beginning of the game, but even just a short ways into it, you're actually overflowing with it afterwards, but there is that sort of initial hurdle as well. However, like a lot of games, a lot of this kind of devolves into a bit of a meta. For starters, assault rifles in this game are outrageous. They are almost universally effective and usually the best choice in most situations. Sniper rifles can also be incredibly effective. And then probably best of all are explosives. They can be a little expensive, but they are single use. You can equip them to any character and just use them. And while there are a variety of perks, etc. that can make them better, they're pretty much universally useful, regardless of training perks, etc. And oftentimes, especially in the late game when you can pick up RPGs, you can just one-shot whole encounters with a well-placed explosive. So overall, I would describe the difficulty as being all over the place. However, if you are still having trouble, every time you complete the game, it is possible to export your characters and then start a new game with those already leveled up characters. And this includes Supreme Jerk. It's very possible to start Supreme Jerk with characters who have already seen the end game. And because of this, I would say the initial parts can be a little rough, and then there are areas in California where you're likely going to hit a few difficulty spikes, but you can mitigate that through a variety of means, and overall it's not too bad, but it can definitely be a little annoying. Now, from here, let's talk about character creation. As I mentioned, there's a default squad you can take, and then you can also create new characters as well. This ultimately comes down to attributes, skill points, and perks. Attributes arguably being the most important part. Your attributes are not set from character creation onward. You will get 1 extra attribute point every 10 levels, but you're going to only get probably about 4 of them roughly to spend in a normal playthrough. So your beginning allotment is pretty important. However, you can sort of set up exactly what you need at character creation, making the extra 4 that you're likely to get through gameplay to be fairly redundant. But for the most part, the attributes do what you would expect them to do, with a few notable interesting points. So in a lot of these style games, the attribute that governs your action points in combat is usually the most important one, as this is a turn-based action point system that we're using, and while they took steps to mitigate that a little bit by causing a variety of attributes to contribute to your action points, there is nonetheless a very important stat, and this is intelligence, because intelligence is going to both give you action points and extra skill points every level. And beyond that, it's usually the normal stuff. Charisma is going to let you recruit more companions, if you want to call them that, which we'll talk about in a second. Strength is obviously great for melee characters, as well as your carry weight, that kind of thing. Just the usual suspects here. But the skills are where things get a little bit interesting. There are 3 main types of skills: combat, general, and knowledge. And this is going to be obviously combat skills like which type of weapon you're using, and then more nuanced stuff like cracking safes, electronics, surgeon, and medic, though these are a tiny bit clunky in their execution. There's several of them which kind of govern the same thing but slightly different. For instance, medic and surgeon. Medic is going to allow you to heal in combat very easily, though surgeon is the one you need to, say, revive a downed character, meaning that it's pretty important that someone in your party has both of those things. And we see this again with the persuasion skills: hard ass, smart ass, and kiss ass. These all largely do the same thing, but it's divided across 3 different skills. So in the later entry, Wasteland 3, I can see why they basically combined most of this stuff down into 1 skill, because a lot of it was very redundant. Moreover, there isn't really any skill checks in conversation outside of hard ass, kiss ass, or smart ass, which usually just let you skip a few things here and there or convince someone to do something for you in an easier fashion. So while the skills overall can seem like a lot, and they certainly can be, you can have up to 7 party members. You're going to have a ranger squad of 4 people, and then you can take on 3 companions. There are like 18 to 20 companions in this game who all have a variety of skills that you can take along with you, and can balance out the rest of your party and fill in the gaps. There are some popular ones, but most of these guys don't really have a story as opposed to just a background. They don't have a lot of quests or interactions outside of 1 or 2 fun little things. For instance, Scotchmo, who is a hobo you can take along who's a fan favorite, will actually steal booze away from your other characters, and if you dig into his background, his wife died and he became a drunk. So there's background there, but that's pretty much all they get. And then every 4 levels, depending on your attributes and your skills, you can get various perks, which do all sorts of beneficial things, which are pretty straightforward, and everyone has a general selection of them as well. And overall, this combines to create a system that is easily min-maxed, honestly. You don't have to do anything crazy. Generalist characters perform pretty poorly here, so in a lot of ways you're encouraged to specialize in something, especially when you get ultimately 7 characters. And while it's certainly not an amazing system because of, again, some of the redundancy in the skills, it is nonetheless a system that's going to allow you to create really awesome characters that feel genuinely unique in spite of the things I've mentioned. But from here, let's talk about gameplay and world building a little bit. Now, as you're traveling around the Wasteland, most of what you're going to be doing is solving problems as you encounter various locations. Some places will have a sort of perfect solution, if you will, where you can kind of serve everyone's interests and move forward. And in other cases, you're going to have to pick the lesser of 2 evils kind of thing, or just the evil option, I suppose. Though what's interesting here is, having played Wasteland 3, I know for a fact that oftentimes the solutions that are considered canon for Wasteland 3 are not actually the best solutions possible in many cases, which I thought was cool because it honestly led to some more interesting interactions. So even though there are the occasional perfect solution, it's not necessarily the outcome that was chosen for the sequel. And this is actually something Wasteland 2 did as well. There are options from Wasteland that are honestly pretty horrific that Wasteland 2 carried forward as canon, further sort of cementing my point about Wasteland 2 being a true successor to that first game in many more ways than it really needed to be. and a great deal of the characters that you're going to interact with in Wasteland 2 are returning from the original Wasteland. The General of the Desert Rangers, General Vargas, is one of the characters from Wasteland. Angela Death, who joins you as a companion early in the game, is also from the first game. And the other sort of main people from the first game as well make appearances, even if they are somewhat minor. So in this way, I think they really nailed making a world that felt alive, especially when you start looking at the smaller details like the resources that I mentioned. How are people's food and water being accounted for in this post-apocalyptic desert? How are we handling things like radiation? All of that gets explained and dealt with in a way that feels really awesome, actually. And quite notably, very distinct from Wasteland 3. While I would say Wasteland 3 is a relatively serious game, it nonetheless has a more stylistic approach to things like graphics, etc. And ultimately, because of this, the tone of Wasteland 2 feels much more serious and dire in the face of the apocalypse, as opposed to Wasteland 3, which went a little more on the zany and silly side, which is its own brand of fun, but strikes a very different tone to the second game. And because of this, it really feels like the actions you're taking and the things you're doing matter. They have consequences. If you go around killing everyone, the Rangers will send a death squad after you, basically, because you're giving the Rangers a bad name. And there's all sorts of little details like that to account for things you're doing that I think feel really fantastic as a player and someone who loves these type of games. And even the dialogue system reflects this a little bit. So if you're unaware, a lot of early video games would have sort of type interfaces where you would type in your response to something or to ask somebody a question. And this is a feature that has largely fallen by the wayside over the years. However, Wasteland 2 has that, and while it is mostly negligible, as you will be presented conversation options still, you can occasionally ask NPCs about something you heard and they might have information about it. And in a few cases, there are actually quest solutions that revolve around gathering information and asking an NPC about it without directly being told or without it being a conversation option, which I thought was an incredible touch. So needless to say, I'm a huge fan of the gameplay and world building of this title. However, for as much as I sing the praises of that, I do have some criticisms about the combat, which we've already gotten into a little bit, but let's talk about a little more directly. Combat is a grid-based, turn-based combat system that uses action points. Pretty standard system. Movement and attacking, etc. all costs action points. Each character's turn lasts until they're out of action points. This particular game uses an initiative order, which is noteworthy because Wasteland 3 uses a team system where your team will go, the enemy will go, etc. Whereas Wasteland 2 has an initiative where sometimes the enemy goes and then you'll go, etc. It's sort of intermingled. Combine this with the variety of weapons you have access to, the explosives, and combat can be pretty fun, but I would say it does get a little stale after a while because you kind of get to a point where every combat encounter becomes essentially the same thing, which is probably my biggest criticism of it. Especially later in the game when it starts devolving into basically just spamming explosives or one type of weapon to deal with the overwhelming numbers of enemies of one type that you're going to be facing. Though in spite of that, it is a game that gets the small details of combat relatively well, as the grid that you're on is relatively intuitive. And what I mean by that is whenever you have a character whose turn it is selected, it shows you how far they can move, and also attack. The grid itself is also pretty somewhat ignorable, if you will. There were very few times that I genuinely noticed I was playing on a grid, which I think is noteworthy. Though there is also a cover system that can almost be entirely ignored, as it doesn't play a huge factor into combat, but being in cover will grant you some defensive bonuses, and that is a huge change from Wasteland 3, where cover is a big deal. It's incredibly important. Wasteland 3 is as much a cover shooter as it is a turn-based RPG. And then we also have things like armor types. Your characters will be wearing armor. It does matter. Heavier, bulkier metal armor is conductive, which energy weapons do an insane amount of damage to, whereas they deal incredibly reduced damage to other things, or just normal enemies, if you will. So while the combat certainly isn't bad, in a weird way, I honestly think it's the weakest point of this game. Because as I mentioned, by the end of the game, it all kind of devolves into a very same approach. It didn't really feel like I had a lot of unique builds, despite attempting to. The game just doesn't really allow for that to work via the sort of enemy spam towards the end of the game, which is interesting because the characters you make can feel really unique, but how things play out in combat is just very cut and dry after a little while. Now from here, let's talk about the Steam Deck actually. So the Steam Deck is obviously much more recent than Wasteland 2 is, but I am excited to say that this game performs very well on the Steam Deck, actually. It does have controller support these days, which obviously is great for the Steam Deck, though I will say for whatever reason, the game refused to realize that I was using a controller. I actually had to go into the settings and manually change things to controller layouts within the game's options before it would work. But after that was sorted out, it was pretty much a breeze to play. The game runs really well on the Steam Deck. All the resolutions seem good to go. All of the buttons, etc., were very easy to navigate. And I think what surprised me the most about this was actually how smooth of an experience this was on the Steam Deck, as CRPG gaming on that particular piece of hardware tends to be a bit hit or miss. But in this particular case, I'm very happy to report that it was honestly a really good experience. I could see people playing this on Steam Deck for sure. But that brings us to our positives, negatives, and then we will wrap this thing up. Now, on the positive side of things, I loved all the various ways you could make a character. Characters feel very unique, even if unfortunately the combat doesn't towards the end of the game. It genuinely felt like each character I made had a purpose, various skills, things they were good at, things they were bad at, and they felt very fun and unique, and it's easy to grow attached to them as a result. I also really enjoyed the tone of this game. It feels much more serious, like an apocalypse has happened and you're struggling to survive, and they nailed that part of it, which is interesting because that's something I think Wasteland 3 doesn't really have. Things can certainly feel dire in that game, but it feels much more silly in a lot of ways, which is certainly interesting. And then, of course, the other positive is the world itself. I think they did so much more to solidify and immerse people in the world of Wasteland than was necessary, but I'm really glad they did because it makes the overall experience of all the Wastelands feel very connected, which makes them very rewarding to play through when you're still seeing the same characters all the way in Wasteland 3. On the negative side of things, the game is overall kind of clunky. There are certain things, especially in the late game, where quest solutions will play out over time in a very unintuitive way. Things will just kind of catch you out of nowhere. As I mentioned, the end-game combat in particular, I don't think was particularly well done, as a lot of it revolves around you fighting the same types of enemies over and over and over again, which ultimately involves the same strategy, which makes a lot of your attempts at role-playing and building a character feel kind of pointless when you reach that second half of the game. And sadly, the last negative for me is that the main story was pretty weak. In some ways, it's almost identical to the first game's main story. The main story is probably the least interesting thing about this game overall, and it feels in some ways kind of disconnected from a great deal of the game, which is a shame because everywhere else you turn, there's awesome choice and consequence that absolutely affect the Wasteland later and of course in inslides. But nonetheless, I was pretty on the main story. Now, all of that of course brings us to our conclusion. Wasteland 2 is a fantastic example of the CRPG revival from the early 2010s. It's not perfect. A lot more of the CRPGs that have released more recently have fixed and addressed a lot of the things that I would say I didn't care for in this one, but at the same time, this really captures the feeling of a Wasteland a lot better than some of the other Wasteland games in a way that makes it really easy to feel immersed. It's somewhat clunky, and I'm happy to have played this game and see how they got to the things they got to in Wasteland 3 and how they refined some of the points of this game to make them play a little smoother in that third game. But what I do think was lost in the translation was the tone of this particular title. But nonetheless, a fantastic game, a great CRPG. I can see why people would like this as opposed to Wasteland 3, and it's easy for people to pick a favorite there as they are relatively different games, in spite of all the things that they share, such as their setting, characters, etc. But in addition to all of that, Wasteland as a series, as a franchise, is one of those things that is actually really tied to the overall history of video games, which I admit I'm a bit of a sucker for. But to wrap this up and stop rambling, I think it's an awesome game that was developed by people who clearly loved the franchise, as that shines through every aspect of this title. Now, as it stands, Wasteland 2, the director's cut, which also comes with the regular version, and a copy of the original game that they remastered after the fact, is like $30. You can regularly get it on sale, though I would happily pay another $30 for this, as this is a great game with a lot to love, even if it does stumble in a few places. That, guys, is all I've got for you today. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. We are getting closer to 100,000 subscribers every day, which obviously I couldn't do without viewers like you. So, truly, thank you so much. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.